The wind howled across the barren expanse like a chorus of forgotten souls. The ground beneath his boots crumbled in pale flakes, and each step seemed to echo in a place where time had stood still. At the edge of a vast, dry basin, a man stood with his loyal dog beside him, both of them staring down at a sight so surreal it felt like a dream. Below them stretched row upon row of rusted hulls, skeletal masts and ghostly decks, once proud ships now stranded in a desert of salt and silence. It was as though the sea itself had died and left behind a graveyard of forgotten giants. The man's breath caught in his throat. The dog's ears twitched at the eerie stillness. Something about this place felt alive with secrets, waiting to be unearthed. If you believe in kindness, second chances, or the unbreakable loyalty of animals, please take a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe to Pawsitive Tales. Your support helps us bring more true inspired stories of courage, compassion, and hope to life. The man's name was Daniel. He wasn't an adventurer or a thrill-seeker. He was just a quiet mechanic from a small town who had lost almost everything when his father passed away. His father had been a shipbuilder and a storyteller, a man who spoke of oceans and harbors as though they were living friends. After the funeral, Daniel felt a strange pull toward places his father used to mention, as though the old man had left him a breadcrumb trail of memories. He began taking road trips with only his dog Shadow for company. Shadow had been rescued from a cold, wet ditch one winter, a half-frozen, unwanted pup who grew into a loyal companion. Together they had crossed highways, forests, and forgotten towns, but nothing compared to the sight before them now. As Daniel and Shadow descended the rocky slope toward the first ship, the air grew heavier, tinged with rust and salt long evaporated. The dog moved cautiously, nose low, tail still. Daniel ran his fingers along the corroded steel of the nearest hull. It was massive, a cargo ship with its nameplate eroded to illegibility. Barnacles turned to dust under his touch. He could almost hear the echoes of sailors' footsteps, the creak of wood, the crash of waves that no longer existed. This wasn't just a graveyard of ships, it was a graveyard of stories, lives, and dreams. And Daniel had no idea yet what he was about to find. The deeper they went, the stranger it became. Some of the ships had doors hanging open, as if someone had left in a hurry. Inside, there were frozen moments of time, rusting radios, moldy logbooks, cracked mugs on tables. Daniel felt like an intruder in a world that had been suddenly abandoned. Shadow sniffed at everything, but kept glancing back at Daniel with that unspoken question dogs have. Are we safe here? Daniel tried to reassure him with a pat on the head, but he couldn't shake the sense of being watched, not by a person, but by history itself. He thought of his father and how he used to talk about a fleet lost to politics and greed. Ships built for trade and aid, never used, left to rot when the water vanished. This had to be the place, the lost fleet of the Aral Sea, but there was more. In his father's stories, there had been whispers of a hidden cargo, something precious enough to be erased from records. Daniel had dismissed it as folklore. Now, surrounded by these steel carcasses, the legend clawed its way back into his mind. Could it be true? As night began to fall, Daniel and Shadow set up a small camp between two massive hulls. The sky turned orange and then black, studded with stars. The silence was absolute, broken only by the soft breathing of Shadow as he curled up near Daniel's feet. Daniel's flashlight beam danced over the sand and steel, catching glints of metal and shards of glass. That's when Shadow pricked up his ears, stood, and padded off toward the bow of a nearby vessel. He barked once sharply. Daniel's heart jolted. Shadow rarely barked unless something was really wrong or really important. Daniel followed the dog, climbing a rusted gangway that creaked under his weight. Inside the ship's cabin, the air was musty and cold. Shadow's nose led them to a hatch on the floor, half covered by debris. With a grunt, Daniel pulled the debris aside and heaved the hatch open. A stale gust of air rose from the darkness below. He lowered his flashlight into the space and froze. Dozens of wooden crates lined the compartment, stacked neatly as though waiting for delivery. Their markings were faded but legible enough. Medical supplies, blankets, water purifiers, humanitarian aid, all of it untouched for decades. Daniel's throat tightened. These supplies could have saved thousands of lives if they hadn't been forgotten here. He imagined his father's face, the disappointment in his eyes when talking about bureaucracies that failed ordinary people. Shadow whined softly, as if sensing Daniel's turmoil. This wasn't just a discovery. It was a tragedy sealed in steel and sand, but it wasn't too late to do something. For hours, Daniel and Shadow documented everything with his phone. Serial numbers, crate labels, ship names. He sent messages to local historians and journalists attaching photos. He couldn't sleep that night. He lay awake under the cold stars, feeling the weight of what they had found. Shadow lay close to him, warm and steady, like an anchor in a storm. For the first time in years, Daniel felt his father's presence, not as grief, but as a quiet, guiding hand. The next morning, as the sun rose over the ghost fleet, Daniel made a decision. He would not let this discovery fade into another forgotten story. He contacted relief organizations, government offices, anyone who might listen. At first, no one believed him, but the photos went viral online. Within days, journalists and activists began arriving at the site. They were stunned, just as Daniel had been. Headlines called it the lost humanitarian fleet and the graveyard that could still save lives. Trucks were arranged, helicopters scheduled. Even after decades, some of the supplies were still usable or could be refurbished. What had been left to rot in silence was now a beacon of hope. Shadow became a symbol in every photo. This lone dog beside a man who refused to look away from injustice. Children sent letters and drawings of the hero dog of the desert. Daniel tried to deflect the praise, but deep down he knew he hadn't done this alone. It was Shadow who had led him to the hidden hold. It was Shadow who had given him the courage to keep going when the emptiness felt crushing. In a world where so much is lost, sometimes it takes a loyal animal to show us where the real treasures lie. Weeks later, as Daniel stood once more at the edge of the basin, now bustling with volunteers and aid workers, he felt something shift inside him. He wasn't just a grieving mechanic anymore. He was part of something bigger, an act of redemption, not just for himself, but for the forgotten people who were supposed to receive this aid, for the sailors who had crewed these ships, and for his father, whose stories had led him here. Shadow sat by his side, fur gleaming in the sunlight, tail flicking against the sand. They had turned a graveyard into a lifeline. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to Pawsitive Tales. It's your support that allows stories like Daniel and Shadow's to reach the world and maybe inspire someone else to act with kindness, courage, and hope. Special request: before the video ends, please leave a comment telling us what this story made you feel or reminded you of. Your words mean more than you know. Daniel took one last look at the fleet. The wind no longer sounded like a chorus of lost souls. It sounded like movement, change, and possibility. He placed his hand on Shadow's head, whispered a thank you only the dog could hear, and together they walked back into the world, not as wanderers anymore, but as keepers of a story that refused to die.